I want to be upfront about something before we start. When I began reading what Padre Pio said about sin, really reading it, going through his letters, the testimonies of his spiritual children, the accounts collected in biographies like those of Bernard Ruffin and Alessio Parente, my first reaction wasn't reverence. It was resistance. I had a version of sin in my head that was manageable, understandable, a kind of moral accounting where you mess up, you recognize it, you try again, clean, contained. And then I started reading what this man actually said, not the edited quotes, not the inspirational excerpts, the full weight of what he believed about sin, about the soul, about what happens when a person turns away from God repeatedly and calls it nothing. It took me about 3 weeks before I stopped pushing back against it, and the thing that finally broke through, I'll get to that, was a letter he wrote in 1918 to his spiritual director. It wasn't meant to be public. It's the kind of letter you write when you're not performing anything for anyone. That's where we're starting today. The first thing that stopped me was how Padre Pio talked about the nature of sin itself. We tend to think of sin as a failure, a slip, something that happens when willpower runs out or circumstances press in. And that framing is almost comforting because it puts sin in the same category as forgetting to pay a bill or eating badly for a week. A lapse, recoverable. Padre Pio didn't talk about sin that way. In his correspondence, and here I'm drawing particularly from the 4-volume collection of his letters, the Epistolario, which covers decades of his private spiritual direction, he consistently described sin not as a stumble, but as a turning, a deliberate reorientation of the soul away from what it was made for. Not always dramatic, not always loud, often quiet, incremental, almost gentle in how it happens. He wrote to one of his spiritual daughters, and I'm paraphrasing here, not quoting directly because the full passage needs context, that the soul that sins casually is not a soul that fell. It's a soul that walked away. And the terrifying thing, he said, is that it often doesn't feel like walking. It feels like standing still. I sat with that for a long time, because what he was describing is something that doesn't announce itself. You don't feel the reorientation happening. You feel ordinary, maybe a little tired, maybe a little distracted. And underneath that ordinariness, something is shifting. The first conclusion I came to after weeks of reading is this. Padre Pio treated sin with a weight that most of us are not comfortable with, not because he was harsh or joyless. The accounts of people who knew him describe someone with a sharp wit, a genuine warmth, someone who could make a room laugh. But when it came to sin, he didn't soften it for pastoral comfort. He described it as it is. And that made me ask, why are we so resistant to that? Let me tell you about the letter. In 1918, Padre Pio was 31 years old. He had been at San Giovanni Rotondo for less than a decade. The stigmata had appeared on his hands and side that same year, September, according to the documented accounts. He was already becoming something that people came to see, came to confess to, came to be near. The external attention was building. And in the middle of all of that, he wrote to Padre Agostino, his spiritual director, about what he was experiencing internally. The letter is not a theological treatise. It's a man trying to articulate something that is pressing against the limits of language. What struck me, what I couldn't stop thinking about, was his description of what he felt when he encountered souls that had grown cold to sin. Not hostile souls. Not souls that knew they were choosing evil and chose it anyway. Souls that had simply stopped feeling the weight of it. Souls for whom sin had become background noise. He described this as, in his words, one of the most painful things his priestly life had given him to witness. More painful, he suggested, than outright rebellion. Because rebellion at least implies that you know what you're turning from. Coldness implies that you've forgotten there was anything to turn from at all. My difficulty with this, and it took me a while to be honest with myself about it, is that I recognized the description, not in some dramatic spiritual crisis, in the ordinary numbness that settles in when you've made peace with something that deserved a longer fight. When you've reclassified something from serious to fine so many times that it doesn't even occur to you to classify it anymore. That's what the 1918 letter broke open for me. Not that I was some exceptional sinner, but that the gradual cooling Padre Pio described is not the story of someone far from the faith. It can be the story of someone sitting in the pew every Sunday who has simply, slowly, stopped feeling the weight of what they're saying. Here's something I didn't fully appreciate until I spent time with the accounts of people who went to him for confession. Padre Pio spent an extraordinary portion of his priestly life in the confessional. There are estimates, documented in Ruffin's biography, suggesting he sometimes spent up to 16 hours a day hearing confessions. People came from across Italy, across Europe, eventually from around the world. The line to his confessional stretched for days. There are accounts of people waiting 3, 4, 5 days for a turn that lasted minutes, and what many of them reported, what made his confessional unlike any other they had experienced, was that he seemed to know things he hadn't been told. I want to be careful here because this territory is easy to sensationalize, and I don't want to do that. The accounts are documented. They're in the testimonies gathered for his beatification process, in the writings of people who had no obvious reason to exaggerate or invent. What they describe is a confessor who could name sins that hadn't been spoken, who could complete confessions that penitents had begun and then stalled in, who sometimes sent people back to examine something they thought they had already covered. What this produced, across the accounts I read, was a particular kind of confrontation that most people find almost impossible to engineer for themselves. The confrontation with a sin they had already made peace with. This is the thing Padre Pio seemed to understand with a clarity that cuts through almost everything else he said about sin. The sins that damage a soul most deeply are not usually the dramatic ones. The dramatic ones we remember, we feel them, we confess them, we carry them. The ones that do the quieter, longer damage are the ones we have explained away, reframed, filed under "it's complicated" or "I didn't have a choice" or "everyone does this." He didn't let those stay filed. And what I kept noticing in the testimonies is that people who experienced this, who had a sin named that they had been quietly carrying for years, didn't describe the experience as humiliating. They described it as relief, as if something had been pressing against them without a name, and suddenly it had one, and they could actually deal with it. There's something important in that. Of all the things I came to understand across this month of reading, there was one I kept setting aside, coming back to, setting aside again. Padre Pio believed, and he stated this plainly in multiple contexts to multiple people, that habitual sin changes what a person can perceive, not just what they choose, what they can see. He described this in terms that are deeply traditional within Catholic theology, the dulling of the conscience, the progressive hardening of the will, but the way he framed it wasn't primarily doctrinal. It was observational. He was describing what he had watched happen to people, what he had seen, the long accumulation of small compromises due to someone's capacity to recognize truth when they encountered it. I found this the hardest to sit with because it doesn't leave you much middle ground. Either there is something that sin actually does to perception, some real degradation of the soul's capacity to read reality clearly, or the entire moral framework that Padre Pio operated from is a kind of useful fiction. There's no comfortable third option where you get to keep the consolation of the saints without the weight of what they actually believed. And what I kept coming back to is this: the people who spent the most time around Padre Pio, his spiritual children, the friars who lived with him, the theologians who examined him, consistently described him as someone who saw people with unusual clarity. Not harshness, clarity. The capacity to love someone while seeing them accurately. If that clarity came from somewhere, and if his own testimony about where it came from is taken seriously, from decades of prayer, penance, and what he described as a continuous war against sin in his own soul, then the conclusion follows almost without effort. The way to see clearly is to be serious about what clouds the vision. That's uncomfortable. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But I think it's the most honest conclusion this month of reading left me with. I want to make sure I don't leave you with a distorted picture. Because one of the things that surprised me, genuinely surprised me, even after weeks of reading, is how central mercy was to everything Padre Pio said and did around sin. This is not what you expect when you encounter someone who takes sin as seriously as he did. The usual cultural pairing is seriousness about sin equals harshness towards sinners. But that's not what the accounts show. It's not even close. The testimonies of people who went to him broken, who arrived at his confessional carrying things they had never said aloud, things they were certain put them beyond the possibility of forgiveness, describe someone who received those things with a tenderness that is, frankly, difficult to read about without feeling it. There's an account, widely cited by those who knew him, of a man who came to San Giovanni Rotondo having committed what he described as unforgivable sins. He had not been to confession in years. He arrived expecting rejection, or at least the performance of acceptance with judgment underneath. What he received, by his own account, was something else entirely. Padre Pio wept with him. This is the part of Padre Pio's teaching on sin that I think gets lost when people only encounter the serious side. The seriousness was in service of something. It wasn't about moral rigor as an end in itself. It was about not letting people stay in a place that was killing them without telling them. You can't offer someone real mercy if you've first told them their wound isn't serious. That's not mercy. That's the avoidance of discomfort dressed up as kindness. Padre Pio took sin seriously because he took souls seriously, because he believed what was at stake was real, and because he had seen, more than almost anyone, what genuine mercy, the mercy that looks at the actual thing and forgives it anyway, could do to a person. I started this month wanting to organize what Padre Pio said about sin into something useful. A list, maybe, 5 points, something you could save and come back to. That's not what I ended up with. What I ended up with is harder to package. It's more like a question I'm still sitting with. How much of what I call peace is actually peace, and how much of it is the slow process of getting used to something I should still be troubled by? I don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure Padre Pio would have wanted me to have one too quickly. If you've been reading or thinking about any of this yourself, if there's a conclusion you've resisted or a moment where something he said landed differently than you expected, I'd actually want to hear about it. Not to collect it, just because I think this is the kind of material that means something different to each person who sits with it. I'll be back next time with something that starts in a very different place, but I think it ends up strangely at the same one.